The wind was a blade, sharp and cold, slicing across the Wyoming prairie. It drove needles of ice into Tabitha Mason's face, a face already numb with cold and fear. She stumbled through snow that came up to her knees, one hand clutching the swell of her belly, the other trying to keep a tattered shawl from being torn away by the gale. Hours. She had been walking for hours. Ever since the stagecoach driver, a man with cruel, dead eyes, had pointed a gun at her and told her to get out. Her presence was bad luck, he'd snarled after a wheel shattered in the growing storm. Her pleas were just whispers, stolen by the wind before they could even form. The sun was gone. The temperature was plummeting. And Tabitha knew, with a certainty that was colder than the snow, that if she didn't find shelter, she was going to die, her and the baby inside her. She was 6 months pregnant, alone, and fighting the desperate, seductive urge to just lie down in the soft, white snow and let it all end. Her boots were worn through, paper thin against the frozen ground. The numbness that started in her toes was now creeping up her legs, a familiar, terrifying signal she knew from the harsh winters back home. Then through the blinding curtain of white, she saw it, a dark shape against the horizon. It was just a smudge, a hint of something solid in a world of swirling chaos. A hill, maybe. Or, if God had any mercy left for her, a building, a home. She pushed forward, her body screaming with every step. The wind shifted, a cruel trick that nearly sent her sprawling. As she caught her balance, a pain, sharp and terrifying, shot through her abdomen. A contraction. Not now, she begged the empty wilderness. Please, it's too early. The dark shape resolved itself not into a cabin, but a small stand of pine trees. The hope that had flared in her chest died, leaving only the bitter ash of disappointment. Trees were better than nothing, but they weren't walls. They wouldn't stop the wind. As she reached the first tree, another contraction seized her, stronger this time. She gasped, leaning against the rough bark, her breath coming in ragged clouds. When the pain finally receded, her legs gave out. She slid down the trunk, sinking into the shallower snow beneath the branches. She could go no farther. This was it. She tucked her hands into her armpits, a futile attempt to hoard the last dregs of her body's warmth. I'm sorry, little one, she whispered to her belly, tears freezing into tiny crystals on her cheeks. I tried so hard. Her mind drifted. She saw her parents' faces, etched with disappointment. She saw Henry Blackwell, the banker's son who had promised her marriage, his face a mask of cruel dismissal when she told him she was carrying his child. She had risked everything to get to her cousin in Laramie, her last hope in a world that had turned its back on her. Now, as the world began to fade to black, she heard something through the howl of the wind, the steady beat of hooves. It had to be a dream, her dying mind offering one last comfort. But then a voice cut through the storm, deep and real. Hello? Is someone out there? She tried to answer, but her throat was frozen solid. All she could manage was a weak, pathetic cough. But it was enough. A large figure swung down from a horse, a silhouette in a wide-brimmed hat moving through the snow toward her. He knelt down, and through her frost-caked eyelashes, Tabitha saw his eyes. They were a startling, piercing blue. Ma'am, he said, his voice laced with concern. Can you hear me? Yes, she breathed, the word barely a sound. His eyes widened as he took in her swollen belly. Christ almighty, he muttered, shrugging out of his own heavy coat. You're with child. He wrapped the coat around her shoulders, and the sudden warmth was so intense it was almost painful. We need to get you warm, fast. My cabin's not far. Can you stand? She tried, but as she pushed herself up, another contraction, the most powerful yet, ripped through her. She cried out, collapsing back against the tree. The baby, she gasped, her voice thin with terror. I think it's coming. The man didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Hold on, ma'am, he said, his voice a steady rumble against her ear. I've got you. He carried her to his horse, settling her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. His arms came around her, a solid, warm shield against the storm. His body blocked the wind, his presence a sudden, unbelievable anchor in the chaos. Name's Jacob Sullivan, he said, his voice close as he urged the horse forward. Most folks call me Jake. Tabitha, she managed through chattering teeth. Tabitha Mason. Well, Miss Mason, he said, his arm tightening around her. You hold on tight. We're going to get you and that baby somewhere safe. She leaned back against his chest, the jolts of the horse's steps sending fresh waves of pain through her. The contractions were coming closer now, one crashing into the next. It hurts, she cried out. I know. Jake's voice was a low murmur. Not much further. Through the swirling snow, she saw it, a faint golden glow. It grew brighter, resolving into the windows of a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney like a promise of life. There she is, Jake said, a note of profound relief in his voice. Home sweet home. He brought the horse to a halt by a small stable and dismounted, reaching up to lift her down. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs buckled. He caught her again, sweeping her back into his arms and kicking the cabin door open with his boot. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was clean and dominated by a roaring stone fireplace. Jake carried her straight to the narrow bed in the corner, setting her down gently on the pile of quilts. Let's get you warmed up, he said, his hands moving with surprising gentleness as he pulled off her frozen, useless boots. Another contraction tore a scream from her throat. Her hands clenched the quilts, twisting the fabric into knots. Jake was by her side in an instant, his large, calloused hand covering hers. Squeeze as hard as you need to, he said, his blue eyes filled with a steady concern. When the pain finally ebbed, she felt a gush of warmth spread beneath her. My water broke, she whispered, shame and fear warring inside her. Jake just nodded, his face grimly determined. I've helped birth foals and calves, he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. Can't be that different. He moved with a quiet efficiency, helping her out of her sodden dress, carefully preserving her modesty with blankets. He positioned pillows behind her back, his touch gentle and respectful. But as another contraction gripped her, his expression grew serious. I need to see how things are, he said, his cheeks coloring slightly. If that's all right. Tabitha could only nod, past all embarrassment now. The baby was coming, and this stranger, this quiet cowboy, was her only hope. His hands were sure as he checked her progress, and his face grew tight. Baby's coming fast, he announced. When the next pain comes, you need to push. The next contraction built like a monstrous wave, and Tabitha bore down with a primal scream, drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed. Jake was her anchor, his voice a steady presence in the storm of pain. That's it, Miss Mason. You're doing fine. Rest now. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the world had shrunk to this small, warm room. The rhythm of pain, of pushing, of Jake's calm, encouraging voice. Time ceased to exist. I can see the head, Jake said, his voice suddenly sharp with excitement. One more big push, Tabitha. That's all it'll take. She gathered every last ounce of her will, every shred of her remaining strength, and pushed. A moment of searing, unbearable pain, and then release, silence. For one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Then a thin, reedy cry cut through the air, a cry that grew stronger and louder with every passing second. Jake's weathered face broke into a wide, brilliant smile as he laid the squirming, wailing infant on Tabitha's chest. You have a daughter, Miss Mason, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. A beautiful little girl. Tears streamed down Tabitha's face as she looked at the tiny, red, furious creature. She was so small, yet so full of life. Hello, little one, she whispered, her finger tracing the baby's soft cheek. I'm your mama. Jake worked quickly, cutting the cord, cleaning the baby and Tabitha with warm water from the fire. His hands were incredibly gentle, his gaze repeatedly drifting to the mother and child with a look of pure wonder. You did real well, he said, wrapping the baby in one of his own clean flannel shirts. It swallowed her whole. Both of you. Exhaustion crashed over Tabitha, a wave that threatened to pull her under. Thank you, she murmured, her eyelids impossibly heavy. You saved us. Jake shook his head. You did all the work. I was just in the right place at the right time. He tucked the blankets in around them, his movements careful. Rest now. I'll keep watch. As she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, she felt his hand, rough and calloused, brush a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch was as light as a feather. The last thing she saw was his face. The lines of concern softened into something else, something she couldn't name, as he watched over her and her new daughter. The storm still raged, but inside Jake Sullivan's cabin, a new life had begun. But Tabitha's ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. Tabitha woke to the smell of coffee and the soft gurgles of her daughter. For a moment, she was completely lost. The rough-hewn ceiling, the strange but comfortable bed, the warmth of the fire. Then it all came rushing back. The blizzard, the pain, the stranger with the kind blue eyes. She turned her head. Jake was sitting at the small table, whittling a piece of wood. The morning light caught strands of auburn in his dark hair. He'd shaved, and without the stubble, he looked younger, his face weathered but handsome. He looked up as if sensing her gaze, and a smile transformed his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," she admitted, her voice raspy, "but better, so much better." He brought her a cup of cool water, helping her sit up. The simple kindness made her want to weep. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for everything. We would have died out there." Jake's expression was serious. "No thanks needed, Miss Mason. Couldn't leave a dog out in that." He glanced at the baby nestled beside her, and his eyes softened. "She's a fighter, your little girl, born in a blizzard and crying like a mountain lion." Tabitha looked down at her daughter. She had a dusting of dark hair and a determined set to her tiny chin. She tried not to look for any resemblance to Henry. "Have you thought of a name?" Jake asked, pulling a stool closer to the bed. She had planned on Elizabeth, after her mother. But that name belonged to a different life, a life of parlors and propriety in Massachusetts. This child was born of the storm, of the wilderness. "Hope," she said, the name coming to her in a rush of inspiration. "Her name is Hope." Jake nodded slowly, a look of deep approval in his eyes. "Hope, that suits her." He said the name with a strange sort of reverence, as if it held a special meaning for him, too. The baby began to fuss, and as Tabitha moved to feed her, Jake stood abruptly. "I'll give you some privacy. Need to check on the horses." He pulled on his coat and was out the door in a flash, leaving Tabitha in the quiet warmth of the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine, glittering white. As Hope nursed, a wave of fierce, protective love washed over Tabitha, followed by an equally powerful wave of fear. How could she possibly provide for this child? What would they do? Jake returned, stamping snow from his boots. "Trail to town won't be passable for a few days," he announced, his tone casual, but his eyes were watching her closely. "I've imposed on you enough," she began, the words tasting like ash. "If you could just lend me a horse." "You're not going anywhere for at least a week," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You just had a baby, Miss Mason, in a blizzard. You need to heal." "But I can't stay here," she protested, even as every fiber of her being yearned to do just that. "I'm a stranger. This is your home." "Gets lonely talking to the horses all day," he said with a small, sad smile. "It's nice, having company." The next few days passed in a haze of nursing, sleeping, and slowly regaining her strength. Jake was the perfect host. He cooked for her, insisted she keep his bed while he slept on a pallet by the fire, and even carved a small, rough cradle for Hope from an old wooden crate. He was kind, respectful, and asked nothing in return. Too kind. On the third day, she felt strong enough to join him at the table. "Jake," she began, "I have to ask, why were you out in that storm? It seems like a miracle you found me." His expression grew somber. "Was checking my trap lines. Nearly stayed in town. But something told me to head home." He shrugged, a faint flush on his cheeks. "Call it a hunch." He studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something, Tabitha? About the father?" She took a deep breath and told him everything. Henry Blackwell, The promises, the betrayal, her family casting her out. She expected pity, or perhaps judgment. Instead, Jake's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "Sounds like a coward," he said, his voice a low growl. The simple validation was so powerful, it almost broke her. She told him about her cousin Ellen in Laramie, her last hope for a new start. Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he made an offer that stunned her. "The trail will be clear in a few days," he said. "But you don't have to go. You and Hope could stay here. Until spring, maybe. Give yourselves time to get stronger." The offer was a lifeline, a temptation she hadn't known she was craving. To stay in this safe, warm cabin with this quiet, gentle man. But it was impossible. "What would people say?" she whispered. "An unmarried woman, living with a bachelor." "We could say you're my widowed sister," he suggested. "Come to stay after losing your husband." The lie felt wrong. Another secret to carry. "I appreciate the offer, Jake, truly, but I need to stand on my own 2 feet. For Hope's sake." Disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. "The offer stands, and either way, I'll take you to Laramie myself when you're ready." That night, as she nursed Hope by the firelight, she was racked with doubt. Was she a fool to turn him down? She was already growing far too fond of him, of the safety he represented. She'd trusted a man once, and it had destroyed her life. Could she ever risk it again? The next morning, Tabitha woke to find Jake gone. A note on the table said he'd gone to check the trail into town. Needing fresh air, she wrapped Hope snugly and stepped outside for the first time. The world was blindingly white and silent. She walked around the small homestead, a well-kept cabin, a stable, a corral. It was a peaceful, lonely place, and then she saw it. Tucked away behind the cabin, near a partially frozen stream, was a small plot of land bordered by stones. It was a grave. A simple wooden cross was pushed into the frozen earth. Curiosity warred with a sense of intrusion, but she found herself drawing closer. There was a name carved into the wood. Margaret Sullivan. Beloved wife. 1848, 1868. Jake had been married. His wife had died only 3 years ago. He had never mentioned her. Not once. A cold knot formed in Tabitha's stomach. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. It was the second grave. Beside Margaret's, there was a much smaller mound of earth, marked only by a pile of stones. It was the size of a grave for a small child, or an infant. There was no name, no cross, just a silent, heartbreaking pile of rocks. Hoofbeats announced Jake's return. She turned, her heart pounding, as he rode into the clearing. His face lit up when he saw her, but his smile faded when he followed her gaze to the graves. "Ah," he said quietly, dismounting. "You found Maggie's resting place." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to pry." "Nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice flat. He stared at the graves, his face a mask of old pain. "Influenza took her. Winter of '68. We'd been married less than a year." He didn't look at Tabitha. He didn't mention the smaller grave. He just stood there, a man haunted by ghosts she couldn't see. And Tabitha realized with a sickening lurch that she wasn't just a stranger he had rescued. She was a woman with a newborn child, living in a house of profound, unspoken grief. A house with secrets buried just beneath the snow. Jake finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "She was a good woman. We had plans. A family." He trailed off, then forced a shrug that didn't reach his haunted eyes. "That's life out here. Beautiful but harsh." He still hadn't acknowledged the tiny grave beside his wife's. The silence about it was louder than any words he could have spoken. Tabitha held Hope tighter, a sudden chill creeping over her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Is that why you were out in the storm?" she asked softly. "When everyone else stayed in town?" He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It was a raw, naked vulnerability. "Maybe," he admitted. "After Maggie, being alone suited me, or I thought it did." He reached out, his finger gently tracing Hope's cheek. "Finding you two, it reminded me there's more to life than just surviving." The moment was shattered by Hope, who let out a small, squirming cry. Jake stepped back, his mask of stoicism firmly back in place. "We should get inside," he said, his tone all business. "I made some progress on that cradle I was telling you about. A proper one." Back in the warmth of the cabin, he showed her the new cradle he was building from smooth pine boards. He had already started carving a delicate pattern of stars along the sides. It was a beautiful, thoughtful gift. "It should be finished by tomorrow," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Just in time for, well, for whatever you decide." The unspoken question hung between them. Stay or go? Before Tabitha could even begin to form a reply, there was a sharp, sudden knock at the door. They both froze. Visitors were clearly not a common occurrence. Jake crossed to the door, his movements wary. He opened it to find a man bundled in furs, his horse breathing steam in the cold air behind him. "Tommy," Jake said, his voice tight with surprise, "what brings you out here?" "Message from town," the man, Tommy, said, his eyes wide as he took in the scene inside the cabin. He stared at Tabitha, then at the baby in her arms. "Doc Wilson sent me. The stage driver, Bennett," he finally confessed, "told everyone he put a pregnant woman out in the blizzard." Tommy shook his head. "Search party's been looking for days. Most folks figured you were a goner, ma'am." Jake stepped slightly in front of Tabitha, a protective gesture. "She's safe. Miss Mason and her daughter are both safe. The baby arrived the night of the storm." "Well, I'll be damned," Tommy breathed. "Begging your pardon. That's a miracle, that is." He shifted his weight, his gaze finding Tabitha again. "There's more. There's a lady in town, asking after you. Says she's your cousin. Came all the way from Laramie when she heard you were missing." "Ellen?" Tabitha gasped. "Ellen is here?" "Arrived yesterday," Tommy confirmed. "Worried sick." Tabitha's mind reeled. Ellen had come for her. But as Jake was telling Tommy to ride back and let everyone know they were safe, Tommy added one more thing. "It ain't just your cousin asking questions, ma'am," he said, his brow furrowed. "There's another fella, a stranger. Been in town a couple of days. Rich fella from back east. He's been asking about you, too. Offering a reward for any news." A cold dread washed over Tabitha. "What? What did he look like?" Tommy shrugged. "Fancy clothes. Soft hands. Called himself Mr. Blackwell. Henry. Henry was here, in Wyoming, looking for her." The safe, warm cabin suddenly felt like a trap. Jake's eyes met hers, and the concern she saw there was now mixed with something else, something hard and dangerous. He knew that name, and he hated it. The news that Henry Blackwell was in town changed everything. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. Jake's face had become a thundercloud, his jaw set in a hard line. He knew the name Blackwell, and whatever connection he had to it, it was violent. "We'll go to town tomorrow," Jake said, his voice low and strained. His eyes, usually so kind when they looked at her, now held a glint of steel. "You need to see your cousin, and the doctor." He didn't mention Henry, but the name hung between them like a ghost. The ride to town the next morning was tense and quiet. Jake had harnessed his horses to a small sleigh, tucking blankets tightly around Tabitha and Hope. He barely spoke, his gaze constantly scanning the snow-covered landscape as if he expected trouble to leap out from behind every pine tree. Their arrival caused a stir. People spilled out of the general store and the saloon, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. But Tabitha barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the door of the doctor's office. It burst open, and a woman rushed out. "Tabitha!" It was Ellen, older, her face etched with worry, but unmistakably her cousin. She wrapped Tabitha in a fierce hug, her practical demeanor crumbling into tears of relief. "Oh, thank God! I thought I'd lost you." She pulled back, her eyes falling on the bundle in Tabitha's arms. "And this must be the baby." "This is Hope," Tabitha said, her voice thick with emotion. Ellen's eyes softened. "She's beautiful, a miracle." Her gaze then shifted to the tall, grim-faced man standing beside them. "And you must be Mr. Sullivan, the man who saved them." "Just did what anyone would," Jake muttered, tipping his hat. Not anyone, Ellen said sharply. That driver, Bennett, is going to face charges. The whole town is in an uproar. She ushered Tabitha towards the doctor's office. Come, Dr. Wilson is waiting. Tabitha gave Jake a questioning look. I'll see to the horses, he said, his voice still tight. I'll be back. His eyes held hers for a moment, and in them, she saw a promise of protection that went far beyond mere kindness. Dr. Wilson was a gentle older man who clucked with indignation over her story and cooed with delight over hope, pronouncing them both remarkably healthy. You're healing well, my dear, he concluded, but you must rest. No long journeys for at least 2 weeks. As he spoke, a commotion erupted outside on the main street, raised voices, followed by the sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. Oh dear, the doctor muttered, peering out the window. It seems Mr. Sullivan has found Mr. Bennett. Tabitha rushed to his side. Outside, Jake had the burly stagecoach driver pinned against the wall of the general store. Jake was leaner, but he moved with a coiled intensity that was genuinely frightening. Several townsmen had gathered, not to break it up, but to stand with Jake. Your Mr. Sullivan seems to have strong feelings on the matter, Ellen observed from behind her. He's not my Mr. Sullivan, Tabitha said automatically, though her heart was pounding. Just as Jake released the terrified driver with a final, snarled warning, Tabitha saw another figure step out of the saloon. He was tall, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that looked ridiculously out of place. His face was handsome, familiar, and currently twisted into a mask of disbelief and rage. Henry Blackwell. His eyes locked on Tabitha through the window. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then his gaze dropped to the baby in her arms. The color drained from his face. He took a step towards the doctor's office, but Jake, seeing the movement, turned and blocked his path. The two men stood face to face in the middle of the snowy street, a silent, deadly tableau. Tabitha, Ellen said, her voice sharp and low. We need to talk. What is Henry Blackwell doing here? Before she could answer, the doctor spoke, his eyes still fixed on the scene outside. Blackwell, he mused, polishing his spectacles. That name sounds familiar. Wasn't it the Blackwell Land and Cattle Company that drove Old Man Miller to ruin a few years back? Bought up his debt and took his ranch right out from under him. He glanced at Jake, who was now speaking to Henry in a low, menacing tone. Terrible business. Miller's daughter, as I recall, she was married to a young rancher. Took it awful hard. The doctor paused, his eyes widening in sudden realization as he looked from Jake to the sign on the building across the street. Miller's daughter. Dear Lord, that was Margaret Sullivan. That was Jake's wife. The room tilted. Jake's wife. The Blackwell Company. Henry. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a nightmare. Henry hadn't just ruined her life. He had destroyed Jake's too, and he hadn't even known it. Outside, the confrontation escalated. Henry, accustomed to getting his way, tried to push past Jake. Jake didn't move. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet fury. The office door opened, and Jake stepped inside, his knuckles scraped raw, his face pale beneath his tan. He ignored Ellen and the doctor, his eyes finding only Tabitha. Your cousin tells me, he began, his voice dangerously calm, that you were planning to go to Laramie. Tabitha nodded, unable to speak. You can't, he said flatly. You and Hope, you're staying with me. It wasn't an offer anymore. It was a command. Mr. Sullivan, Ellen began, her tone protective. The man who fathered this child, Jake continued, his gaze never leaving Tabitha's, is the same man whose family destroyed mine. His company drove my wife's father to his grave. The grief of it, Jake's voice broke for a fraction of a second. The grief of it put Maggie into an early labor. We lost the baby, a little girl. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. Maggie, she never recovered. She faded away. The influenza just finished what the Blackwells started. Silence, the tiny office was suffocating. He's not just here for you, Tabitha, Jake said, his voice a raw whisper. The land my cabin is on. It was part of Maggie's father's ranch. It's the last piece the Blackwell Company doesn't own. He's here to finish the job, to take the last thing I have left. He took a step closer, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. He won't get it, and he won't get you, or that little girl. He glanced down at Hope, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm raging around her. He thinks you're a loose end, a complication, but he's wrong. A grim, terrible smile touched Jake's lips. You're not a complication, Tabitha. You're a reckoning. The truth was a brutal, staggering blow. Tabitha leaned against the wall, her legs threatening to give out. Jake's past and her present were tangled together in a knot of tragedy and greed, all centered on one man, Henry Blackwell. The kindly stranger who had saved her was the sworn enemy of the man who had ruined her. Ellen, ever practical, recovered first. What are you saying, Mr. Sullivan? That Henry Blackwell is a threat to my cousin? He paid the stagecoach driver to leave her for dead, Jake said, the words dropping like stones into the silence. Bennett as much as admitted it when I had him against the wall. Said a rich fella paid him to make sure a certain female passenger got lost in the storm. Permanently. The doctor gasped. This is a matter for the sheriff. It is, Jake agreed. But the sheriff is a county away, and Henry Blackwell has money and influence. By the time the law gets here, it'll be too late. His eyes found Tabitha's again. He knows where you are now. He knows about Hope. He won't just let that go. A terrifying memory surfaced in Tabitha's mind. Henry's words when she'd refused the money he offered to take care of the problem. He had told her, his voice cold as ice, I will not let you ruin my life, Tabitha. I will do whatever it takes. She hadn't understood the true menace in his words then. She did now. I need to leave, Tabitha whispered, panic clawing at her throat. We can go to Laramie, Ellen. No, Jake said, his voice absolute. His reach is longer than you think, and you're not strong enough for that journey, the doctor said so himself. The safest place for you and Hope right now is with me. At your cabin? Ellen asked, her brow furrowed with concern. A lone woman and a baby. He won't expect her to be there, Jake reasoned. He'll think you're here in town. It's the last place he'll look. I'll take you back at dusk. We'll get supplies. You'll stay there until I can handle Blackwell. Handle him? Tabitha echoed, her voice trembling. Jake, what are you going to do? I'm going to make sure he can never hurt anyone again, he said, his face a grim mask. He turned to Ellen. I need your help. I need you to stay at the boarding house, and if anyone asks, you tell them your cousin is resting and not to be disturbed. Buy us time. Ellen studied Jake for a long moment, her sharp eyes assessing him. Then she gave a curt nod. I'll do it, but you'd better keep her safe, Mr. Sullivan, or you'll have me to answer to. You have my word, Jake said simply. The rest of the day was a blur. They bought supplies at the general store, the owner refusing payment, pressing extra food and warm blankets into Jake's arms. The town, it seemed, had chosen its side. Tabitha saw Henry once more, watching them from the window of the boarding house, his face a portrait of cold fury. The sight made her shiver. As dusk fell, they slipped out of town in the sleigh. The journey back to the cabin felt different this time. The peaceful quiet of the wilderness now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential threat. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a hiding place. Inside, Jake bolted the door and drew the shutters, plunging the room into the warm, flickering light of the fire. The world outside ceased to exist. You'll be safe here, he said, his voice softer now. He looked exhausted, the weight of the day etched on his face. He looked at her, at Hope sleeping in her cradle, and the hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by that same gentle concern she had first seen in the storm. Jake, she began, her voice small, the other grave, by your wife's. He closed his eyes, the pain on his face so raw it was difficult to look at. That was our daughter, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She lived for 2 days. We were going to name her Hope. The breath left Tabitha's body in a painful rush. Hope. He hadn't just approved of the name. He had been hearing the name of his own lost child, the cradle he was carving with stars, the tender way he looked at her daughter. It was all cast in a new, heartbreaking light. I'm so sorry, she wept, tears finally overflowing. I didn't know. You couldn't have, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears of his own. He knelt by the fire, poking at the logs with unnecessary force. When I found you, when you told me her name, I thought I was losing my mind. I thought it was a ghost, a sign. He looked up at her, his blue eyes swimming with a decade of grief. But she's not a ghost. She's real. He reached out, his hand hovering over the cradle before he drew it back. Blackwell took my family from me once, Tabitha. I won't let him do it again. He stood up, his resolve hardening. You and your daughter, you've brought life back into this house. I didn't even realize how dead I was inside until you got here. He crossed the small space between them. I'm going to protect you. I swear it on Maggie's grave, on our daughter's grave. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear. Get some rest, he murmured. Tomorrow the fight begins. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind sounded like footsteps. Tabitha lay in the bed, holding Hope close, her body humming with a terrified energy. Jake sat in a chair by the door, a rifle resting across his lap, his silhouette a stoic guardian in the firelight. He hadn't taken the pallet on the floor this time. He was on watch. Just before dawn, he came to the bed. I have to go, he whispered. I need to find out what Blackwell's planning. Don't go, she begged, clutching his arm. It's too dangerous. Staying here is more dangerous, he countered gently. I'll be back before nightfall. Keep the door bolted. Don't open it for anyone but me. Fire the rifle if there's trouble. I'll hear it. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face, on the baby in her arms. Then he leaned down and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to her forehead. Stay safe, Tabitha. And then he was gone, slipping out into the gray morning light, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of the cabin. The day stretched into an eternity. Tabitha tried to keep busy, tending to Hope, tidying the already spotless cabin, but her ears were constantly strained for any sound from outside. The rifle Jake had left propped against the wall seemed to mock her. She'd never fired a gun in her life. As the sun began to sink, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, panic began to set in. Where was he? Had Henry done something to him? Then she heard it, the crunch of boots on snow. Relief washed over her. It was Jake. He was back. She rushed to the door, her hand on the bolt, and peered through a crack in the shutter. It wasn't Jake. It was Henry Blackwell. And he was not alone. Two other men were with him, rough-looking men with guns in their hands. They were moving quietly surrounding the cabin. Tabitha's blood ran cold. He had found them. Jake's plan had failed. They were trapped. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the rifle, then at Hope, who was stirring in her cradle. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Henry's voice, smooth and cold, cut through the door. Tabitha, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk. Tabitha scrambled away from the door, her mind racing. The rifle. She had to get the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift it. It was heavy, alien in her grasp. She had no idea how to even use it. Hope started to cry, a thin wail that cut through the terrifying silence. You see, Tabitha, Henry's voice was closer now, right outside the window. You can't hide. The child is making it quite clear where you are. Open the door, and no one will get hurt. It was a lie. She could hear the lie in his voice. He had come to finish what he started in the blizzard. Go away, Henry, she screamed, her voice thin and reedy. There was a low chuckle from outside. That's not going to happen. Then his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. I gave you a chance to walk away, Tabitha. You should have taken it. Crash. The heavy wooden shutter on the window splintered, a heavy boot kicking it inwards. One of the hired men was trying to climb through. Without thinking, Tabitha raised the rifle, pointing it at the window. Her finger found the trigger. She closed her eyes and pulled. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward. The room filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The man in the window screamed and fell back outside. The hell, she has a gun! One of the men yelled. Get the door! Henry roared. A heavy shoulder slammed against the cabin door. The wood groaned, the bolt straining. Another slam, and the wood around the lock began to splinter. Tabitha fumbled with the rifle, trying to reload it, but her hands were clumsy with terror. The spent cartridge was stuck. It was useless. She was defenseless. The door crashed open. Henry stood there, framed in the doorway, his handsome face contorted with rage. The two hired thugs stood behind him, their guns raised. "You foolish, foolish girl," Henry snarled, stepping into the cabin. His eyes fell on Hope, who was now screaming in her cradle. "You've caused me so much trouble." He took another step, his intentions clear. He was going to silence them both, for good. Tabitha stood her ground, placing herself between him and the cradle. "You won't touch her," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. Henry laughed, a cold, empty sound. "And who's going to stop me? You?" "No," a voice said from behind him. "Me." Henry spun around. Jake stood in the shattered doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. In his hands, he held a shotgun, its twin barrels pointed directly at Henry's chest. He wasn't alone. Behind him, emerging from the trees, were at least a dozen men from the town. The doctor, the blacksmith, Tommy, all armed with rifles and pistols. Henry's face went pale. "Sullivan," he hissed. "You shouldn't have come here, Blackwell," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. He took a step into the cabin, his eyes flicking to Tabitha, a silent question. She gave a tiny nod to show she was unharmed. The relief that washed over his face was quickly replaced by an icy calm. "This is my property," Henry blustered, trying to regain his composure. "And this is a private matter between me and this woman." "She shot at us," one of the hired men whined, clutching a bleeding arm. "Looks like she missed," Jake said, without taking his eyes off Henry. "A mistake I don't plan on making." The two hired guns looked from Jake to the crowd of armed townsmen behind him. They exchanged a nervous glance, then slowly lowered their weapons. "This ain't worth dying for," one of them muttered, backing away. Henry was alone. He looked from Jake's shotgun to Tabitha's defiant face, to the crying baby in the cradle. His empire, his future, was being threatened by a woman he had cast aside, and a backwoods rancher he had already ruined once. "This changes nothing," Henry sneered, his arrogance returning. "You can't prove a thing. I'll have the law on all of you for this." "Oh, I think we can prove a few things," said a new voice. Sheriff Miller, a man with a thick mustache and a weary expression, stepped through the crowd, followed by the stagecoach driver, Bennett, who was in handcuffs. Bennett wouldn't look at Henry. He just stared at the floor, his face a miserable shade of gray. "Mr. Bennett here has had a change of heart," the sheriff said, his eyes hard as stone. "Decided to tell us all about the $500 you paid him to make sure Miss Mason and her unborn child didn't survive the storm. Attempted murder is a hanging offense in this territory, Mr. Blackwell." The color drained from Henry's face. He was trapped, utterly and completely. He made one last desperate move. He lunged for Tabitha, trying to grab her, to use her as a shield. But Jake was faster. The butt of his shotgun swung in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the side of Henry's head. Henry crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence fell, broken only by Hope's wails. Tabitha rushed to the cradle, scooping her daughter into her arms, soothing her with whispered words. Jake was beside her in an instant, his hand resting on her shoulder, his warmth a solid, reassuring presence. "It's over," he said softly. "It's all over." The sheriff and his men dragged Henry and his thugs away. Ellen rushed into the cabin, her face pale with worry, and enveloped Tabitha and Hope in a hug. The nightmare was finally at an end. As the townsmen dispersed, their quiet congratulations and pats on Jake's back echoing in the twilight, Tabitha, Jake, and Ellen were left alone in the damaged but safe cabin. Jake knelt and picked up one of the carved stars that had broken off the cradle in the commotion. He turned it over and over in his calloused fingers. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking at her. "The cabin's getting a bit cramped. Was considering adding another room. Come summer." Tabitha's heart, which had only just started beating normally again, began to pound for a different reason. "A room for the little one," he continued, his voice low. "She'll need her own space eventually. And maybe you'd like a proper bedroom too. One with a door." He finally looked up, his blue eyes clear and full of a vulnerable, hopeful light. I'm asking you to stay, Tabitha. Permanently. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you to marry me, to let me be a father to Hope, to let us be a family. Tears streamed down Tabitha's face, but for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of pure joy. She thought of the fear, the cold, the loneliness, and she thought of this man who had walked out of a storm and into her life, who had not only saved her, but had fought for her, had faced down the ghosts of his past to protect her future. Yes, she whispered, the word a prayer of thanks. Yes, Jake. 1,000 times yes. They were married in the spring, in the small church in town. The whole community was there to celebrate the woman and child they had all come to see as their own. Hope, legally adopted by Jake and now bearing the Sullivan name, was the guest of honor, passed from one set of loving arms to the next. Jake added the new rooms onto the cabin, and then another and another as their family grew. A boy, Jacob Jr., with his father's blue eyes, and then twin girls named Margaret and Elizabeth. The small, lonely cabin became a sprawling, bustling ranch house filled with laughter and love. The Blackwell Land and Cattle Company collapsed under the weight of scandal and criminal charges, its assets sold off. Jake, with the help of a loan from the town, was able to buy back the land that had once belonged to his first wife's family, rebuilding what Henry Blackwell had tried to destroy. Years later, on a cold winter night, with a blizzard howling harmlessly outside their warm, sturdy home, Jake would gather his children by the fire and tell them the story. The story of a fierce storm, a lost and desperate mother, and the brave cowboy who found her in the snow. It was a story of survival, of justice, and of a love that was born in the darkest of nights. It was the story of how a man who had lost everything and a woman who had nothing found that, together, they had it all. If you were moved by Tabitha and Jake's story of hope and survival, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next strange, dark, and mysterious tale.